Hi, I'm Jessica Powers, publisher at Catalyst Press, and I'm here today with Caroline Kurtz, the author of A Road Called Down on Both Sides, Growing Up in Ethiopia and America, which came out last summer in 2019. Um, and we're here to talk a little bit about the book today, as well as what Ethiopia is like. So can you tell me a little bit about why you wrote this book? It's a memoir, so tell us a little bit about why you wrote this book.
Well, I wrote it over a long period of time, and I kind of learned the craft of writing as I wrote. I think the original impetus came from my experience in growing up around people that were different from me and coming back to the United States and finding that growing up in Ethiopia had made me different from people in the United States, and wanting to have some way to tell my story that let me feel like I was a human being and could be understood maybe by people who are different from me, which in my case includes people here in the United States who grew up in the United States in the 1960s.
Right. So, and in the story, though, it's not just about, I mean, we want to talk a little bit about this third culture kid, but it's also a story about your family, your sisters,
Absolutely,
your mother.
absolutely. Yeah, I couldn't write about my childhood experience growing up in Ethiopia without writing about my family and the richness of my family life, because we did live in a very isolated part of Ethiopia and didn't have other American or Western culture playmates. So my playmates were my sisters, and my family was very, very influential. And they were the nest that I grew up in. There just was no way to write about a context in another country without couching it in the middle of my family. And of course, family dynamics are fascinating and complex, and they're also very universal. And what I learned as a writer, as I was learning the craft, is that the more detailed you can be about the unique details of your life, the more universal, paradoxically, the more universal it becomes. So my family life is surely has resonance with other people who had families, and is a way of making a connection with my reader.
Mm-hmm. Cool. Well, I had not ever heard this term third culture kid until I read your book when you submitted it, or actually we worked together a little bit before you submitted it. So, and I instantly recognized that I'm a third culture kid because I grew up on the US-Mexico border. My parents were from the Midwest United States, but I was surrounded by Mexican and Mexican American culture. So I grew up in a different home culture than my parents' home culture, and then the culture that was within our home. So that makes me a third culture kid. Can you talk a little bit about your experience as a third culture kid and what that means to you, and you know, I guess the broader picture of this phenomenon?
Yeah, I don't think the term had even been invented when I was growing up as one. It was my generation of now adults who were raised in cultures other than their parents' home culture that were studied, and the term was invented. But psychologists began to recognize that whether it was for business reasons, or whether it was the State Department or the military, or church work in other countries, there were these children that were growing up not part of the country that they were hosted by, but definitely not part of their parents' country and culture, My dad grew up in the completely white Eastern Oregon, Western Idaho border, and my mom grew up in rural Iowa. And so their childhoods and even their early adulthood was completely different from mine. And they had a completely different relationship and feeling about the United States than I did. They always referred to the US as home. And when we got to the US, we felt very ill at ease. We felt the absolute
You and your
reverse of me and
siblings.
my siblings. So I have this sibling group of particularly the four sisters that were closest in age, and then we have a gap, and there's a brother and a sister, so six of us. And we grew up as each other's playmates. So somebody pointed out to me early in a draft that I refer to we as though I had no separate identity aside from my sister. So here I am doing it again. And all of us did feel very ill at ease and not at all at home when we spent 2 years of our education in the United States, and then particularly when we came back to college, because at least when we were in school, we had our parents who knew the Ethiopia side of us. When we came back for college, we were just like thrown into an ocean of differentness. So they studied three culture kids and made up the term and identified some ways that these children, like myself, have coped with the two cultures that they grew up in, neither of which did they fit in completely. And so they sort of fit best in a crack in between the two. And they relate to each other. They relate to people who also grew up in a crack between cultures.
Mm-hmm.
So that's where the third culture concept comes from. They kind of amalgamate something that is not quite the host culture and not quite their parents' home culture.
Mm-hmm. But what is, of course, is interesting is that, you know, your experience as a third culture kid is very, very different from mine. And so in one sense, that third culture that you experienced is very different than mine, since I grew up on the US-Mexico border in the 80s and you grew up in Ethiopia in the 1950s and 1960s, like worlds apart in terms of culture and historical time setting and political scene and all of these things. But there are some real similarities in how, in kind of the values that we tend to, I guess, ascribe to, or how we approach people. I feel like there's a sense in which you're never quite belonging, and wherever you are, you always feel like there's somewhere else where your heart is.
Yeah, I've had Jewish friends say to me that my background as a Christian missionary daughter, which doesn't seem like it would have much to compare with a Jewish kid in the United States, that it was actually, there's a third culture piece of being a minority in the majority culture as a Jewish kid. So that to me was very, very interesting. And it just goes to show that how the specific unique details of one person's life they touch on the universal, which is the magic of sharing stories.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So tell us a little bit about what Ethiopia means to you today and what it's like today. I mean, you were there very recently. You go all the time. It seems like a couple times a year. Tell us what it's like today and what it means to you today. You no longer live there.
I no longer live there. I've been going back about 3 times a year for the last maybe 4 years, and at least once or twice a year for the last 15 years or so. After I went back in my 40s to teach. And it was at that point that I feel like I kind of I continued my education in diversity in relating across these cultures and the fascination of it. and
Mhm.
the frustration of it that I felt as a child, where I never quite felt like I um, crossed the border on that side well enough. So I learned Amharic. I had Ethiopian friends. I was immersed in a Ethiopian children's school, the only Western or non-Ethiopian teacher much of the time. So that gave me opportunities to experience what I had longed for as a child but didn't have available. And it also just laid a foundation and opened doors for me to keep going back.
Mhm.
So I've taken advantage of that foundation and those doors. And I've been going back, as I said, for a while. I was promoting partnerships between churches in the United States and our partner church in Ethiopia. And then I phased out of that work. And again, that gave me a foundation both for fundraising and also for project development. And I started my own nonprofit to focus on Ethiopia, to focus on Maji.
Mhm.
So I have a nonprofit called Maji Development Coalition. And I,
You had to think, what is the name? I'm the founder of this thing, but what is it called again?
which C word did I use? Company, corporation? Oh no. Yeah, I did have to think for a
I
second.
saw that hesitation.
Yeah, did I get the right one?
It's late in
Um,
the day.
yeah, it is. And my sister and I call it Madiko, Ma for Maji, D for development, Co for that C word.
Okay.
Um, uh, and So my focus was to be very, very collaborative and to empower Ethiopians as much as I could, but to bring some development to Maji because it is still very remote and it's still very cut off. The electric grid doesn't come to Maji, so there's no electricity even to power development.
Mm.
So I've ended up bringing solar units for people to put on grass or tin homes for light in their own homes. And for 2020, this was already in our minds, but it became a much more deeply felt priority with the pandemic. Maji has its first hospital, but it sits empty because there's no electricity. You can't run a hospital without electricity. So the refrigerators are sitting there. For vaccines, the incubators for low weight babies, the surgical table and the surgical lights. There's no way you can use that kind of thing. Um, so I think we're closing in on ordering the solar equipment to electrify and operationalize this hospital, the first hospital Maji has ever
Mm.
had. So I just got back in February from taking a medical team. I'm not a medical person, I was a teacher. But I took 5 medical folks, 4 from Oregon and 1 from Kenya, who came up and met us. And we went down to Maji, and it was kind of a first foray into the medical side of the need there. And it was extremely, people were so grateful. People came and lined up, walked in the rain to get to the hospital. Supposed to be dry season. It wasn't dry season, of course. Um, and lined up, waited under the veranda, hundreds of people. And the medical folks brought rewashable sanitary supplies for young women who often have nothing they can use that allows them to stay in school while they're having their periods. I had no idea how incredibly deeply appreciated that was going to be. But they held a class, like a sex ed class, for about 25 young men and about 50 young women at the local hospital and distributed these things. They tested and counseled about 100 people for HIV. Um, the local leaders welcomed us with a luncheon when we arrived and had a feast for us to thank us as we were leaving and gave us each a framed certificate of thanks. It was the first American trained doctor or nurse practitioner, we had both, from ever, ever to have served people medically in Maji. So it was a very moving experience, and the level of appreciation was just so overwhelming, and it has helped us. That trip in February, came back in late February, and of course everything happened from there. Um, so I'm in touch now with my business manager in Maji about every 10 days by phone. He doesn't speak English, so I'm leading a nonprofit from halfway around the world by phone with my broken Amharic. The magic of it is, number one, he understands me so well. He has a diploma in agriculture. He's an agriculturalist, and I'm a teacher. And we're running this nonprofit together, and we have such a wonderful collaborative relationship. But he's a very wise and respected person in the community. And what I'm seeing is that because I can't go, I would have gone in May. I would have gotten back about 3 weeks ago. Because I can't go to keep moving things along, they are stopping giving me precedence. They are stepping up and making these decisions and going way out on limbs and bringing their community together in these wonderful, amazing new ways. So
it's a good thing.
It's a good thing. It's very humbling because I mean to be empowering, but just my presence as an American from a first world major power, just, they just give me, honor.
Deference, yeah.
Deference, too much. And so here I am stuck in my little house in Portland, Oregon, and it's a good thing. It's just like, how great is that? So I'm just really thrilled, although I hope I can go back to Ethiopia soon, even just to be there, even just to be speaking Amharic, even just to be receiving hospitality and, thanking them for all that they're doing on their side to make this work. It's just one of the favorite parts of my life, is that rhythm of going back and forth.
Well, I very much understand that, because I have similar rhythm and heart connection to South Africa, so I get it. And the U.S.-Mexico border, which is still my home.
Yeah, and you kind of referred to a dynamic in that, which is when you're in one place, you miss things and people in the other place. When you're in the other place, you miss things and people in the other place.
Yep.
So it's a constant.
And you wouldn't want to choose either place.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, when people in Ethiopia say, why don't you come? Why don't you live here with us? The gracious way that I have found to say that is to say, I have grandchildren. Mm-hmm. So going back to that theme of family is just really honored in Ethiopia. And immediately people say, oh, yes, you must live near your grandchildren. But we're glad you come see us.
Well, thank you very much for talking to us today. I think we'll, close that out, just because we're trying to keep these, to relatively short. But this is the book, Down on Both Sides, Growing Up in Ethiopia and America. And you've written a follow-up, which will hopefully come out in another year or two. So, which is more about your time in the Sudan and Kenya. So, for those of you that are just finding out about this, you can get this now, and the second book will be on the way.
And if you want to learn more about my project, you can go to developmaji.org. Developmaji.org.
And Maji is spelled M-A-J-I.
Yes. Thank you.
Thank you.